The coffee in Alec Grayson's cup had grown cold 20 minutes ago, but he kept lifting it to his lips anyway, buying time he didn't want, and watching his son Miles sketch trees that looked more real than the conversation happening across from them. "So you're in construction?" The woman, Sandra, leaned back in her chair, eyeing Miles like he was an unwelcome interruption rather than the 7-year-old boy quietly minding his own business. "Something like that," Alex said, his voice carefully neutral. He'd learned to keep his answers vague. CEO of a tech company worth 8 figures tended to change the entire dynamic of a conversation, and not in ways that mattered to him anymore. Miles looked up from his drawing, those serious brown eyes that looked too much like Caroline's, meeting the woman's gaze for just a moment. She didn't smile, didn't acknowledge him, just turned back to Alec with a tight expression that said everything he needed to know. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Look, you seem nice, but I'm not really looking to be anyone's stepmother right now. Maybe we could try this again when he's older, or at a relative's house." Alec felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the protective instinct that had grown stronger since Caroline died. Miles' pencil stilled against the paper, though he didn't look up. "Actually," Alex said quietly, "I think we're good here." She left without a backward glance, heels clicking against the cafe's worn wooden floors. Mrs. D'Angelo, the elderly woman who owned the place, caught Alec's eye from behind the counter and shook her head with the kind of disapproval that only Italian grandmothers could properly express. Miles went back to his drawing, adding careful shading to the trunk of his tree. He hadn't said a word during the entire encounter, hadn't said much of anything to strangers since the accident 3 years ago, but Alec could read the tension in his small shoulders, the way he pressed his pencil a little harder against the paper. "Hey, buddy, want to head home?" Miles nodded, carefully tearing the drawing from his sketchbook and folding it into his pocket. Another tree to add to the collection in his bedroom, a forest of paper that had grown steadily since the day Caroline never came home from the grocery store. The drive back to their modest rental house was quiet, the radio playing soft, classic rock while Oregon's evergreens blurred past the windows of Alec's deliberately unremarkable Honda. He'd traded in the Tesla months ago, along with the expensive clothes and the downtown Portland penthouse. Everything that screamed money had been carefully put away, stored like relics of a life that felt increasingly foreign to him. Because the truth was simple. Alec Grayson didn't want to be loved for his bank account. He wanted to be loved for the way he made Mickey Mouse pancakes on Saturday mornings and knew exactly how Miles liked his bedtime stories read, with different voices for every character and a pause after each page so the boy could add his own details in whispered asides. He wanted someone who would see Miles first and fall in love with his quiet intelligence, his gentle heart, his way of seeing the world through artists' eyes. The Forbes articles and the tech conference keynotes and the stock options felt like somebody else's life now, distant and unimportant compared to helping his son heal. That evening, after Miles was tucked into bed with his current favorite book and his stuffed elephant that belonged to Caroline, Alex sat in their small living room with his laptop. The dating app glowed on the screen, a parade of profiles that all seemed to blur together after 3 months of disappointing encounters. He was about to close it, about to finally admit that maybe Nolan had been wrong about putting himself out there again, when a new message appeared. June R. Her profile photo showed a woman with kind eyes and an easy smile, sitting on what looked like a library floor surrounded by children's books. Her bio was refreshingly simple. Elementary school counselor. Love stories that make you believe in happy endings. Looking for someone who understands that the best conversations happen over coffee that's been reheated 3 times. "Hi," her message read. "I saw in your profile that you have a son. I work with kids every day, and I think anyone raising a child on their own deserves recognition for doing one of the hardest jobs in the world. If you're ever up for coffee with someone who won't judge you for talking about your kid for the first 20 minutes, I'd love to meet you both." Alex stared at the message for a long time. She wanted to meet them both, not just him, with Miles as an afterthought or an obstacle to work around. Both of them. Upstairs, he could hear the soft sound of Miles turning pages, probably looking at the pictures in his book one more time before sleep claimed him. From his nightstand drawer, Alec pulled out a folded piece of paper, Caroline's last letter, found in her purse after the accident. Her handwriting was hurried, but familiar, probably written during her lunch break at the elementary school where she taught art.
My dearest Alec, I know you'll only read this if something happens to me, so I'll keep it simple. Don't you dare spend the rest of your life in that tomb of grief. Miles needs to see you living, not just surviving. And you, my stubborn, wonderful man, deserve to be loved again. Not for your success or your money or your ability to solve problems, but for your laugh and your terrible jokes and the way you sing off-key in the shower. Find someone who sees Miles the way I do, as the most extraordinary little boy who ever lived. Someone who understands that loving you means loving him too, completely and without reservation. Don't settle for anything less. The 3 years we had were worth a lifetime. Now go make room for someone new to love you both. Forever yours, Caroline. P.S. Miles will need art supplies soon. The good ones, not the cheap set from the drugstore. His trees are getting more sophisticated. Alec folded the letter carefully and picked up his phone. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before he typed back to June. Tomorrow evening at Rosewood Cafe. Fair warning, Miles will probably draw through the entire conversation, and I might spend the first 20 minutes talking about his latest art project. If that sounds okay to you, we'd love to meet you too. Her response came back within minutes. Perfect. I'll bring extra crayons. For the first time in months, Alex smiled as he closed the laptop. The next evening arrived wrapped in the kind of gentle Oregon rain that made everything smell like pine needles and possibility. Alec adjusted Miles's collar for the third time as they sat in their usual corner booth at Rosewood Cafe, watching the door with the careful attention of people who had learned not to expect too much from strangers. Miles had his sketchbook open, working on a detailed drawing of a treehouse that seemed to grow more elaborate with each passing minute. Rope ladders and tiny windows, a bird perched on the roof, a flag fluttering from the highest branch. It was the kind of drawing that revealed his mother's artistic genes, though he'd never met Caroline's encouragement to pursue his talent. "She's late," he murmured, more to himself than to Miles. It was only 7 minutes past their agreed time, but 3 months of disappointing encounters had trained him to read the signs. Late usually meant reluctant. Reluctant usually meant gone. Then the cafe door opened with its familiar brass chime, and a woman stepped inside, shaking rain from a bright yellow umbrella. She had shoulder-length brown hair that was slightly damp despite her efforts, and she wore a simple blue sweater over dark jeans. Practical clothes that suggested someone more concerned with comfort than impression. June. It had to be her because she was looking around with the kind of nervous energy that screamed blind date, and because she moved with the unhurried confidence of someone who worked with children. No wasted gestures, no artificial urgency. She spotted them in their corner booth and headed over, her smile growing more genuine as she got closer. But instead of approaching Alec first, instead of the awkward adult handshake and introduction he'd grown accustomed to, she stopped directly in front of Miles's side of the table. "Hi there," she said softly, kneeling down so she was at eye level with him. "I'm June. Are you the artist I've been hearing about?" Miles looked up from his drawing, startled but not frightened. Something in her voice maybe, or the way she waited patiently for his response instead of rushing to fill the silence. "This is incredible," June continued, leaning closer to study his treehouse sketch. Is that a rope ladder? And look at that bird. Is he the treehouse guardian? Miles nodded, a small movement that might have been missed by someone not paying attention. But June was paying attention. She was studying his drawing with the kind of genuine interest usually reserved for museum masterpieces. "Can I tell you a secret?" she whispered conspiratorially. "I always wanted a treehouse when I was your age. Never got one, but I used to imagine it would look exactly like this." And then, without warning or permission, or any of the careful hesitation that adults usually approached Miles with, she reached out and gave him a gentle hug. Not the awkward pat on the head that strangers sometimes attempted, not the over-eager enthusiasm that made him retreat further into himself, just a warm, natural embrace that seemed to say, "I see you, and you're exactly enough." Miles didn't pull away. In fact, and this was the moment that stopped Alec's breath entirely, Miles hugged her back. His small arms circled her shoulders briefly, and when she released him, he was almost smiling. "Miles," Alec managed, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "This is June." She turned to him then, her eyes bright with something that looked like understanding. "And you must be the dad who raises amazing kids," she said, extending her hand. "Thank you for letting me crash your evening."
Alec shook her hand, probably held it a moment too long, and tried to process what he'd just witnessed. In 30 seconds, this woman had accomplished something that trained child psychologists and well-meaning relatives and months of patient encouragement had failed to achieve. She'd made Miles feel safe enough to accept physical affection from a stranger. Mrs. D'Angelo appeared at their table with coffee and her knowing smile. "The usual for you boys? And what can I get you, dear?" "Whatever they're having," June said, sliding into the booth across from them. "And maybe some hot chocolate for the artist here? That treehouse deserves proper celebration." Miles' eyes widened slightly. Hot chocolate wasn't usually part of their routine, but Alec found himself nodding. Hot chocolate sounds perfect. As Mrs. D'Angelo bustled away, Alec turned her full attention back to Miles's drawing. "You know what this treehouse needs? A story. Who do you think lives there?" Miles picked up his pencil and added a small figure in one of the windows. A boy, Alec realized, with messy hair and a serious expression. "He looks like someone who has important thoughts," June observed. "What do you think he's thinking about?" Miles considered this, then drew a small cloud above the boy's head. Inside the cloud, he sketched what looked like a woman with long hair, her arms outstretched. Alec's chest tightened. Caroline. Even in his art, Miles was still reaching for her. But June didn't ask uncomfortable questions or offer empty platitudes about loss. She simply nodded and said, "She must be someone very special. Is she teaching him something?" Miles looked up at her then, really looked, and Alec saw something shift in his son's expression. Recognition, maybe, or trust? Carefully, Miles tore the drawing from his sketchbook and held it out to June. "For me?" she asked softly. "Are you sure?" Miles nodded and pressed it into her hands. June accepted the drawing like it was precious, which, Alec realized with a start, it was. Miles had never given his art to anyone outside the family. Never. "This is the most beautiful gift anyone's ever given me," June said, and Alec could hear the genuine emotion in her voice. "I'm going to frame it and put it somewhere I can see it every day." Mrs. D'Angelo returned with their drinks, shooting Alec a look that clearly said, "This one's different. Pay attention." He was paying attention. He was watching June blow on Miles's hot chocolate to cool it down, watching his son actually engage with her questions about school and his favorite books. He was listening to her laugh, not the polite, nervous laughter of someone trying too hard, but the kind of genuine delight that bubbled up when Miles told her about his art teacher's terrible jokes. And slowly, carefully, Alec began to hope. The rain had stopped by the time they finished dinner.
leaving the streets of their small Oregon town washed clean and glistening under the old-fashioned street lamps. June had insisted on paying her share, despite Alec's protests, and now they walked three abreast down the quiet sidewalk, Alec on one side, June on the other, and Miles between them, his small hand alternately reaching for his father's fingers and, to Alec's amazement, occasionally brushing against June's. "Tell me about the worst blind date you've ever been on, and don't you dare say this one." I laughed, the sound surprising me. When was the last time I'd laughed on a date? "There was this woman last month who brought her own food to the restaurant, like a full meal in Tupperware containers, said she was on a very specific diet and couldn't risk contamination." "That's not terrible, that's impressive planning," June countered. "What made it bad?" "She wouldn't let Miles touch anything on the table because he might have germs, offered to buy him gloves so he could eat his sandwich without contaminating the shared space." June stopped walking entirely. She wanted to put gloves on a 7-year-old for eating? "That's when we left," Alec said simply. Miles had gone silent for the rest of that day, and Alec had found him later scrubbing his hands raw in the bathroom sink, as if trying to wash away whatever made him unacceptable. "Good," June said fiercely. "That's not dietary planning, that's—" She caught herself, glanced down at Miles, who was listening intently, and moderated her language. "That's not kind." They resumed walking, passing the old bookstore with its warm yellow windows and the antique shop that had been closing soon for as long as anyone could remember. The town felt different tonight, Alec thought. Less like a place they were hiding in, and more like somewhere they might actually belong. "Your turn," he said. "Worst date story." June was quiet for so long that Alec wondered if she'd heard him. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer. "I went out with this guy who seemed really nice online. We met for coffee, and within 10 minutes, he was telling me how lucky I was that someone like him would consider dating someone like me. Said I should be grateful because guys with good jobs usually don't go for the charity case types."
Alex stopped walking this time. What did she do? "I finished my coffee, told him he was right, I was too good for him, and left." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "But for about 20 minutes after, I sat in my car wondering if maybe he had a point." "June," Alex said quietly, and something in his tone made Miles look up at both of them. "That man was an idiot." "Maybe," she said with a shrug, "but growing up in foster care teaches you that most people see you as temporary. Someone to tolerate, not someone to choose. It's hard to unlearn that, even when you know better up here." She tapped her temple. Miles had been listening to every word, and now he tugged gently on June's jacket. When she looked down at him, he pointed to himself, then to her, and made a small gesture with his hands, like he was drawing a circle around the three of them. "What's that, sweetheart?" June asked, kneeling down to his level again. Miles looked frustrated for a moment, searching for words that wouldn't come. Then he took June's hand and placed it over his heart, then put his own small hand over hers. June's eyes filled with tears so quickly that Alex stepped forward instinctively, concerned. But she was smiling through them, looking at Miles with an expression of wonder. "You're telling me I'm not temporary," she whispered. "Is that right?" Miles nodded solemnly and kept her hand pressed against his chest for another moment before letting go. Alec felt something shift in his own chest, a loosening of muscles he hadn't realized were clenched, a warmth he'd forgotten was possible. This woman understood his son in ways that went beyond words. She saw Miles's sensitivity as a gift rather than a problem to be solved. They continued walking, eventually reaching the small park at the center of town. The playground equipment was empty, swings moving slightly in the evening breeze. Miles broke away from them to investigate the merry-go-round, leaving Alec and June alone on a bench that faced the swing set. "Can I ask you something?" June said, watching Miles push the merry-go-round in slow, measured circles. "You don't have to answer if it's too personal." "Go ahead." "His mom, how long has it been?" Alec was quiet for a moment, watching his son play.
3 years. Car accident. She was a... He paused, searching for words that could encompass everything Carolyn had meant to them. She was an art teacher, elementary school, like you. She used to say that every child was an artist, they just needed someone to believe in their vision. She sounds wonderful. She was. He turned to look at June, surprised to find that talking about Carolyn didn't hurt as much as it usually did. Miles hasn't drawn her in almost a year. Tonight at the cafe, when he put her in that cloud above the treehouse boy, he's starting to process, June said gently. That's healthy. And the fact that he felt safe enough to include her in his art while sitting with a stranger, that says something important about where he is emotionally. You think so? I work with a lot of kids who've experienced loss. Miles is healing. Slowly, carefully, but he's healing. And so are you, I think. Alex studied her profile in the lamplight. The gentle curve of her cheek, the patient way she watched Miles play, and the absence of any urgency or agenda in her posture. She wasn't trying to fix them or rush them or prove anything. She was simply present. What about you? Ever been married? Kids? June shook her head. Came close once. Engaged for 2 years to a guy who kept pushing back the wedding date. Finally admitted he was embarrassed to introduce me to his family. Said I needed to work on myself first. Lose weight, get better clothes, maybe do something about my hair. She touched her brown locks self-consciously. I gave him back the ring and decided I'd rather be alone than with someone who saw me as a project. His loss. That's what my friend Gloria keeps telling me. She's the one who made me join that dating app, actually. Said I needed to put myself out there again. Remind me to thank Gloria, Alex said, and June laughed, that genuine, delighted sound he was already growing to love. Miles wandered back over to them, his cheeks pink from the cool air and exercise. He climbed onto the bench between them and leaned against June's shoulder with the casual trust of a child who had decided she was safe. June wrapped her arm around him naturally, and Alec watched his son's eyes drift closed in contentment. When was the last time Miles had fallen asleep against someone who wasn't family? We should get him home, Alex said softly, though he was reluctant to break the spell of this perfect evening. June nodded but didn't move immediately. Alec, June said quietly, thank you. For tonight, for letting me meet him, for... She gestured helplessly, for being exactly who you are. As they walked back toward their cars, Miles drowsy between them, Alec found himself thinking about Carolyn's letter. Find someone who sees Miles the way I do, as the most extraordinary little boy who ever lived. June saw him. She saw them both clearly and without reservation. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something extraordinary. Later that night, after Miles was tucked into bed with June's treehouse drawing carefully placed on his nightstand, Alec found a new sketch in his son's room. 2 stick figures walking hand in hand, a tall one and a shorter one with long hair. Above them, Miles had written in his careful first-grade handwriting, "June is nice."
Miles nodded, then pointed to the 3 figures. "That's us," he said clearly, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet library. Several children looked up from their own work, curious about the boy who rarely spoke, but whose pictures were always the most interesting. Alec felt his chest tighten with emotion. Miles had spoken unprompted, in front of strangers, to share something important, and what he'd shared was a vision of them as a family. "Can I keep this one too?" June asked softly. Miles nodded, and then, in a gesture that made several children gasp with admiration, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a small box of professional-grade colored pencils. They were Caroline's, the expensive ones she'd used for her own artwork, the ones Alec had been saving for when Miles was older. He handed them to June without hesitation. "Miles," Alec started, "those were your mom's." "She would want June to have them," Miles said with the simple certainty of childhood wisdom, "for her library pictures." June's eyes filled with tears as she accepted the precious gift. "I'll treasure these," she promised.
and I'll think of both your mom and you every time I use them." The afternoon session ended, with the children reluctantly packing up their artwork. As they filed out, chattering about their creations, the pigtailed girl tugged on June's sweater. "Miss June, is that boy gonna come back? He showed me how to make my trees look real." "I hope so, Emma," June said, glancing at Alec with a question in her eyes. "Every Saturday," Alec heard himself saying, "if that's okay with Miss June." "More than okay," June said softly. As they gathered Miles's things, a familiar voice echoed from the doorway. "Well, well, so this is the mysterious construction worker." Alec turned to see a woman about June's age standing in the entrance, hands on her hips and an expression of frank curiosity on her face. She had curly black hair, warm brown skin, and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she didn't suffer fools. "Gloria," June said with a slight groan, "meet Alec and Miles. Guys, this is my best friend and the reason I'm on dating apps in the first place." Gloria stepped forward, studying Alec with the intensity of a detective examining evidence. "So you're the one who got my girl smiling again. Gotta say, you're prettier than I expected for someone who supposedly swings a hammer for a living." "Gloria," June warned, but she was fighting a smile. "What? I'm just saying, those are some soft hands for construction work." Gloria reached out and actually grabbed Alec's hand, turning it palm up for inspection. "And that watch looks expensive for someone on a tradesman's salary." Alec felt heat creep up his neck. He'd forgotten to switch out his Rolex for something more modest, a mistake that could unravel his carefully constructed identity. "It was a gift," he said weakly. "Uh-huh. From who?" "My grandmother," Alec lied, hating himself for it. "She had expensive taste." Miles looked up at him with confusion. He knew perfectly well that Grandma Grayson had never given anyone expensive jewelry, but thankfully said nothing. Gloria studied him for another long moment, then shrugged. "Well, expensive watch or not, you made my girl happy last night. She came home glowing like a teenager. Just remember, I know where you live now." She gestured around the school, "and I have connections in every elementary school in the county." "Noted," Alec said, unable to suppress a smile at her fierce protectiveness. As they walked to their cars, June fell into step beside him while Miles ran ahead to examine a particularly interesting pine cone. "Don't mind Gloria. She's just protective. I haven't dated anyone seriously in a long time." "How long?" Alec asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. 2 years. Since the engagement ended. I kind of gave up for a while. Figured maybe I wasn't meant for the whole family thing." "And now?" June stopped walking and turned to face him, her expression serious. "I'm terrified," she admitted, "because for the first time in years I can actually picture it. The whole thing. Family dinners and bedtime stories and Saturday morning pancakes. And that's dangerous. Because what if I'm wrong? What if this is just temporary?" Alec reached out and took her hand, the same gesture Miles had made the night before. "Then we'll figure it out together," he said, "one day at a time." Miles appeared beside them, his pockets bulging with pine cones. "June," he said seriously, "do you want to come to our house for dinner? Daddy makes really good spaghetti." June looked at Alec, a question in her eyes. This was moving fast, faster than either of them had probably planned. But watching Miles beam up at her with hopeful eyes, Alec found he didn't care about the timeline anymore. "What do you say?" he asked. "Think you can handle dinner with 2 guys who take their pasta very seriously?" June's smile was radiant. "I thought you'd never ask." The cottage sat at the end of a winding gravel drive, nestled among Douglas firs that seemed to whisper secrets in the evening breeze. It wasn't grand, just a simple 2-story structure with weathered cedar shingles and a wraparound porch that sagged slightly on one corner. But as June climbed out of her car, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and pine needles,
She understood why Alec had chosen this place. It felt like sanctuary. "It's not much," Alec said, appearing beside her with Miles's backpack slung over his shoulder. "But it's quiet." "It's perfect," June said, and meant it. Through the golden windows, she could see warm light spilling across hardwood floors, and hanging baskets of herbs swayed gently from the porch ceiling. "How long have you lived here?" "About a year. We needed somewhere—" He paused, searching for words. "Somewhere that didn't have memories on every corner." Miles was already racing up the porch steps, eager to show June his favorite hiding spot behind the porch swing. As they followed him inside, June was struck by the careful balance Alec had achieved. The house felt lived in and loved, but not cluttered with the past. A few family photos sat on the mantel, but they were mixed with new memories. Miles's latest artwork, a houseplant that was thriving under someone's careful attention, books that showed signs of being read and reread. "Welcome to our chaos," Alec said, hanging their coats on pegs by the door. "Miles, want to show June your room while I start dinner?" "Yes." He grabbed June's hand and tugged her toward the staircase. "I have to show you my wall." His bedroom was painted a soft green, with glow-in-the-dark stars scattered across the ceiling in actual constellation patterns. But it was the far wall that made June's breath catch. Every available inch was covered with artwork, some clearly his own childish creations, others more sophisticated pieces that must have been Caroline's. Paintings of sunsets and flowers, sketches of Miles at various ages, watercolor portraits that captured quiet family moments with breathtaking tenderness. "Daddy put Mama's pictures with mine," Miles explained, pointing to where his stick-figure families mingled with Caroline's detailed observations of their daily life. "So she's still here, but not sad here." June studied the wall with the attention it deserved, noting how seamlessly Caroline's work flowed into Miles's current creations. Someone had arranged this with great care, honoring the past while making room for the future. "This is extraordinary, Miles. Your mom was incredibly talented. She taught me about colors and how to see things different. Want to see my new one?" He pulled a fresh drawing from his desk, another treehouse, but this one included details June hadn't seen before. A garden below, complete with vegetables and flowers, a tire swing hanging from a sturdy branch, and in the doorway of the treehouse, 3 figures again, but now they were clearer, more defined. The woman had June's wavy hair, and she was holding what looked like a book. "You gave me a story," Miles explained matter-of-factly. "In the treehouse. Mama used to tell stories too, but different ones. Yours are new." June knelt down to his level, touched beyond words. "What kind of stories do you think I tell?" Miles considered this seriously. "Happy ones, about kids who find their families." From downstairs came the sound of something sizzling and Alec's voice calling, "How's everyone doing up there?" "We're good," June called back, then turned to Miles. "Should we go help your dad?" The kitchen was warm and filled with the scent of garlic and herbs. Alec had tied one of Caroline's old aprons around his waist, a cheerful thing covered in dancing vegetables, and was stirring something that smelled absolutely divine. "Put me to work," June said, rolling up her sleeves. "What can I do?" "Salad duty," Alec said, nodding toward a cutting board loaded with fresh vegetables. "But, fair warning, Miles has very strong opinions about tomatoes." "No tomatoes," Miles called out from where he was setting the table with exaggerated care. "They're squishy and weird." "Noted," June said solemnly. "What about cucumbers?" "Cucumbers are acceptable," Miles replied with the gravity of a food critic. They fell into an easy rhythm, moving around each other in the small kitchen with surprising grace. June found herself stealing glances at Alec as he cooked, the way he automatically checked to make sure Miles wasn't too close to the hot stove, how he tasted the sauce and adjusted seasoning with the confidence of someone who'd learned to cook out of necessity rather than passion. "So, what's the story behind this place?" June asked, dicing vegetables with practiced efficiency. "It feels like it has history." "It belonged to Caroline's aunt," Alec said, lowering his voice slightly so Miles wouldn't hear. "She left it to us when she passed last year.
Caroline used to come here as a kid during summers. He gestured around the kitchen with his wooden spoon. All these herbs growing outside? Caroline planted them. Said a house wasn't a home without something growing in the garden. June looked out the window above the sink, where she could just make out raised beds in the fading light. Even in October, something was still thriving out there. Kale, maybe, and what looked like late-season herbs. "Do you garden?" she asked. Alec laughed. "I kill plants, but Miles has inherited his mother's green thumb. He's the one keeping everything alive out there." "I planted the pumpkins," Miles announced proudly from the dining room. "They're getting really big." Dinner was a revelation, not because the food was particularly fancy, just simple spaghetti with homemade sauce and perfectly dressed salad, but because of how natural it felt. Miles chattered about his day, telling June about his math homework and his friend Jake, who could burp the alphabet. Alec shared a funny story about a client meeting that had gone hilariously wrong. June found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't in years, letting go of the careful politeness that usually accompanied new relationships. "June," Miles said suddenly, twirling pasta around his fork with intense concentration, "do you know how to build tree houses?" "I don't," she admitted, "but I know how to research things. We could probably figure it out together." Miles's eyes lit up. "Really? Could we build the one from my picture?" Alec and June exchanged glances across the table. The casual "we" in Miles's question held weight, an assumption of permanence that was both thrilling and terrifying. "That depends," Alec said, carefully. "Do you think June would want to spend that much time with us? Building a treehouse is a big project." Miles looked at June with the serious expression he wore when considering important matters. "Do you want to be our family?" he asked, with the devastating directness that only children possess. The kitchen went quiet, except for the soft tick of the wall clock and the distant sound of wind in the trees. June felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she looked at this beautiful boy who had somehow decided she belonged with them. "I would love that more than anything," she said quietly, "if your daddy thinks it's okay." Miles turned expectantly to Alec, who was staring at June with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Daddy?" "Yeah, buddy," Alec said, his voice rough with emotion. "I think that would be okay." Miles let out a whoop of delight and launched himself from his chair into June's arms, nearly knocking over his water glass in the process. June caught him easily, holding him tight while her eyes filled with tears she didn't try to hide. Over Miles's head, she met Alec's gaze. The careful guardedness she'd seen there on their first date was gone, replaced with something raw and hopeful, and terrifying in its intensity. Later, after Miles had been tucked into bed with extra stories and promises to start planning the treehouse tomorrow, Alec and June sat on the back porch with mugs of tea, watching stars emerge in the clear Oregon sky. "That escalated quickly," June said with a shaky laugh. "Too quickly?" Alec asked, concern coloring his voice. June was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the wall of artwork upstairs, the easy way Miles had claimed Ura's family, the feeling of absolute rightness that had settled in her chest during dinner. "No," she said finally, "not too quickly, just fast enough to be terrifying." Alec reached for her hand in the darkness. "I know this is crazy. We've known each other for exactly 2 days. But June..." He paused, struggling with words. "I haven't seen Miles this happy since before Caroline died, and I haven't felt this hopeful in years. What if I mess it up? What if I'm not good enough for him, for you?" "What if you are?" Alec countered gently. "What if this is exactly what all 3 of us have been waiting for?" It was the first time he'd written about anyone new since Caroline died. Alec smiled and turned off the light, already looking forward to tomorrow. The next afternoon arrived crisp and golden, the kind of October day that made Oregon feel like a postcard. Alec hadn't planned to drive by Maplewood Elementary. He'd been heading to the hardware store for wood stain, a mundane Saturday errand that gave him an excuse to get out of the house while Miles napped. But when he saw the familiar yellow umbrella propped against the school's front steps, he found himself pulling into the visitor parking lot. Through the tall windows of what looked like the library, he could see June sitting cross-legged on a colorful rug, surrounded by a dozen children of various ages. She was reading aloud from a picture book, her voice animated as she gave different characters distinct voices: a gruff bear, a squeaky mouse, a wise old owl. The children were captivated, some leaning forward on their elbows, others curled up like cats in patches of afternoon sunlight. Alex sat in his car for a moment, watching this woman who had somehow slipped past all his careful defenses in the span of a single evening. She looked different in her element, more confident, more herself. Her brown hair was pulled back in a messy bun secured with what appeared to be a crayon, and she wore paint-splattered jeans and a sweater that definitely seen better days. She looked beautiful. Miles stirred in his car seat behind him, blinking awake with the disoriented expression of a child emerging from deep sleep. "Where are we, Daddy?" "June's school," Alex said, the words out before he'd fully thought them through. "Want to see if she's busy?" Miles was suddenly wide awake, pressing his face to the window. "Is she reading the bear book?" "Looks like it. Should we go say hi?" Miles was already fumbling with his seatbelt. They entered through the main office, where a friendly secretary buzzed them in after Alec explained they were visiting Miss Reyes. The hallways smelled like temper paint and that indefinable elementary school scent, floor wax and childhood dreams and the lingering sweetness of afternoon snacks. When they reached the library door, June was just finishing the story. She looked up as they entered, and her face transformed with genuine delight. "Well, look who's here," she said softly, careful not to disturb the children still sprawled on the rug. "Perfect timing. We're just starting art time." Miles needed no further invitation. He settled onto the rug beside a girl with pigtails who was already sorting through a box of crayons with the seriousness of a scientist organizing specimens. Within minutes, he was deep in conversation with her about the proper way to draw clouds, his natural shyness forgotten in the face of shared artistic passion. "He's different here," Alec murmured, taking a seat on a low chair beside June. "More himself." "Kids feel safe in libraries," June said, watching Miles show the pigtailed girl how to blend colors with the side of a crayon. "Something about being surrounded by stories, like anything is possible." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the children create their masterpieces. Alec found himself studying June's profile again, the way she monitored the room without hovering, how she offered quiet encouragement without taking over their projects. She had the gift that all great teachers possessed, the ability to guide without controlling, to nurture without smothering. "Miss June," a boy with gap teeth and freckles, held up his drawing. "Is this good?" "Tell me about it," June said, giving him her full attention. "What's happening in your picture?" "It's my family at the beach. That's my mom, and that's my dad, and that's my little sister who cries all the time." He pointed to each figure proudly. "And that's me building the biggest sandcastle ever." "I can see that. Look at all those towers. What do you think makes it the biggest?" "It goes all the way to the clouds," the boy said seriously. "And it has a moat with real sharks." "Sharks in the moat. Excellent security feature," June said with equal seriousness. And the boy beamed before returning to his work. "You're good at this," Alex said quietly. "I love it," June replied simply. "These kids, they haven't learned yet that the world wants to make them smaller. Every drawing is a masterpiece. Every story is worth telling. I get to see the world through their eyes for a few hours each week." Miles appeared at her elbow, holding up his latest creation. It was another treehouse, but this one was different, more elaborate, with multiple levels and a rope bridge connecting to a second tree. And in the windows, he'd drawn not just the lonely boy from yesterday, but 3 figures: A tall man, a woman with long hair, and a small boy between them. Miles, June breathed, accepting the drawing with reverent hands. This is incredible. Is this the same treehouse from yesterday?
The descent into the underwater canyon was like entering another world. Schools of tropical fish moved through coral formations that had grown undisturbed for decades, and the water was clear enough that Elliot could see the canyon floor 70 feet below. But it was what he found tucked into a natural cave system that made the dive worthwhile. Capella Unit 3 wasn't just a single container, it was an underwater vault. Hidden behind what appeared to be natural rock formations, someone had constructed a sophisticated storage facility using the canyon's natural topography for concealment. Multiple containers, each the size of large footlockers, were secured to a man-made platform that had been camouflaged to look like part of the reef system. Working carefully with underwater cutting tools, Elliot managed to free one of the smaller containers and began his ascent. But as he rose through the crystal-clear water, he noticed something that made him pause 20 feet below the surface. The Artemis was no longer alone on the surface. Two boats now floated above him, their familiar yacht and a larger vessel that definitely hadn't been there when he'd started his dive. Worse, he could see figures moving on the Artemis's deck, and they weren't wearing Maya's brightly colored diving safety gear. Elliot made a decision that would have horrified any diving safety instructor. Instead of surfacing directly, he swam laterally through the underwater canyon system, using the coral formations for cover, until he was positioned beneath the stern of the larger boat. From his underwater vantage point, he could see that the new arrival was a professional dive boat, equipped with commercial-grade underwater equipment and what appeared to be a full technical diving setup. More concerning, he could see underwater lights moving in the canyon below him. Other divers were already exploring the vault site. When he finally surfaced, carefully positioning himself behind the Artemis's stern where he couldn't be seen from the other boat, Maya was waiting for him with obvious relief and barely contained panic. "Dad, thank God. They showed up about 10 minutes after you went down. 3 people, professional diving gear, and they're asking very pointed questions about what we're doing here." "Selena's people?" "I don't think so. These people aren't pretending to be diplomatic. They took one look at our equipment and started setting up their own dive operation." Elliot hauled himself and the container aboard as quietly as possible, then moved into the Artemis's main cabin where they couldn't be observed from the other boat. "Maya, did you get any geological samples before they arrived?" "I got more than samples," she said, showing him a waterproof bag filled with evidence. "Dad, the sediment displacement around that canyon shows signs of regular disturbance going back decades. Someone's been maintaining that vault site, probably for 40 years. "Maintaining it? How?" "Fresh welds on the container mountings, updated camouflage materials, recent modifications to the access routes." Maya's excitement was barely contained despite their dangerous situation. "Mr. Hartman, we know you're aboard. We'd like to have a conversation." The man who appeared in the cabin doorway wasn't Selena DuPont. He was younger, more obviously military in bearing, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "My name is Torres," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "I represent certain international interests in maritime artifact recovery. You've been diving in a restricted area." "Restricted by whom?" Maya asked. "By agreements that were established long before you were born, Dr. Hartman." Torres's eyes moved to the container they'd recovered. "That material belongs to a multinational preservation trust. Unauthorized removal constitutes theft of international cultural artifacts." Elliot found himself thinking about Charlie's letters, about the difference between guardianship and exploitation. And what if the removal is authorized by the original guardian? Torres smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Your father's authority ended when he died, Mr. Hartman. The trust has appointed new guardians." "Like Selena DuPont?" "Miss DuPont represents certain private interests.
We represent governmental ones. Torres moved closer to the container. The question is whether you're going to cooperate with the legal transition of custody, or whether this situation needs to become more complicated. As if to emphasize his point, the sound of equipment being moved on deck above them suggested that Torres's team was preparing for an extended operation. "What kind of cooperation are you looking for?" Elliot asked.
Gloria was reading over her shoulder. Administrative leave? For what? Dating someone? For being a distraction, June said bitterly. For bringing unwanted attention to the school. For not being the kind of person who belongs with someone like him. More calls were coming in. Her phone vibrated constantly with notifications, friend requests from strangers, comments on photos she'd posted months ago, messages from reporters asking for statements. The life she'd built so carefully, so quietly, was being torn apart by people who didn't know her and would forget her name by next week. "Turn it off," Gloria said firmly, reaching for June's phone. "All of it. You don't owe these vultures anything." June let her friend power down the device, grateful for the sudden silence, but she couldn't turn off the thoughts racing through her mind, the questions that felt like accusations. How could she have been so naive? How could she have missed the signs? The expensive watch Gloria had noticed, the way Alec never talked about work stress or money worries, the fact that his modest cottage was probably worth more than she'd make in a decade of teaching. "I have to call him," she said suddenly. "Not yet," Gloria said firmly. "Not while you're this upset. You need to think about what you want to say." But June was already reaching for her landline, the old rotary phone that had belonged to her last foster mother. She dialed Alec's number from memory, her hands shaking as she waited for him to answer. "June?" His voice was strained, worried. "I've been trying to call you. The media found out about your little social experiment," June interrupted, her voice colder than she'd ever heard it. "About how the billionaire decided to see what it was like to date a regular person? That's not what this was. June, please let me explain." "Explain what? How you lied to me from the first moment we met? How you watched me talk about feeling like a charity case while you were worth more money than I'll see in 10 lifetimes? How you let me believe you were someone you're not?" There was silence on the other end of the line. June could hear Miles in the background asking if that was June on the phone, asking when she was coming over again. "I never lied about the important things," Alec said quietly. "I never lied about caring about you, about Miles caring about you, about any of this being real." "But you lied about everything else," June shot back, "and now I'm paying for it. I'm on administrative leave from my job, Alec, the job I love, the kids I work with. It's all at risk because I got involved with someone who thought it would be fun to play pretend." "June, don't," she said, her voice breaking. "Just don't. I can't do this. I can't be someone's experiment or their walk on the wild side or whatever this was for you." She hung up before he could respond, before the sound of Miles calling her name in the background could break her resolution completely. Gloria wrapped her in a hug as the tears finally came, hot, angry tears for the life that had felt so perfect just yesterday morning, for the little boy who had drawn her into his treehouse family, for the man she had been stupid enough to trust with her carefully guarded heart. Outside, a car pulled into her driveway. Through the window, June could see a woman with perfectly styled hair and a cameraman getting out of a news van. "We're not home," Gloria said firmly, closing the blinds. "We're not home to any of them." But even as they sat in the darkened living room, June knew there was no hiding from this. Her quiet life was over. The question now was whether she would have the courage to build a new one from the pieces. Her last thought, before exhaustion claimed her, was of Miles's drawing, the treehouse with 3 figures in the doorway, the garden below full of growing things, the tire swing moving gently in an imaginary breeze. Somewhere in a cottage across town, a little boy was probably wondering why June hadn't called, why the phone kept ringing, why his daddy looked so sad. The hardest part of all was knowing that Miles, innocent Miles, would be the one hurt most by the adults' lies and the media's greed for scandal. She had promised to be his family, and now she was disappearing from his life, just like everyone else had. The thought made her cry harder than anything else. The cottage felt like a tomb. 3 days had passed since June hung up on Alec, and the silence stretched through every room like fog, thick and suffocating. Miles had stopped asking when June was coming over, but he hadn't stopped drawing her. If anything, his artwork had become more frequent, more urgent. Pictures of the three of them taped to windows, tucked under Alec's coffee cup, left on his pillow like prayers made of crayon and hope.
Alec sat at the kitchen table, staring at his laptop screen without seeing it. He'd tried calling June 17 times. Her phone went straight to voicemail now, and he couldn't blame her. The media attention had been brutal. Photographers camping outside her apartment, reporters calling her work, strangers on social media dissecting every detail of her life with the casual cruelty of people who had never been vulnerable themselves. His PR team had offered to make it go away, to paint her as an opportunist or a gold digger, to spin the story in whatever direction would protect his reputation. He'd fired them on the spot. "Daddy?" Miles's voice was small, uncertain. He stood in the kitchen doorway, clutching his latest drawing, his hair sticking up at odd angles from sleep. "Is June mad at us?" Alec closed the laptop and opened his arms, gathering his son onto his lap. Miles felt smaller than usual, fragile in the way children became when their world shifted without explanation. "She's not mad at you, buddy. She's mad at me." "Why?" How did you explain complicated adult failures to a 7-year-old? How did you tell your child that you'd been a coward, that your fear of being loved for the wrong reasons had led you to lie to the first person who'd loved you for the right ones? "I made a mistake," Alec said simply. "I wasn't honest with June about some things, and now she doesn't trust me anymore." Miles considered this with the gravity he brought to all important matters. What kind of mistake? The kind that hurts people you care about, even when you didn't mean to. Miles was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the edges of his drawing. Finally, he looked up at his father with those two wise eyes. "Can you fix it?" "I don't know. I'm trying to figure that out." Miles slid off his lap and walked to the kitchen junk drawer, the one filled with tape and batteries and the detritus of daily life. He pulled out a roll of clear tape and held up his drawing, another treehouse, but this one looked different, sadder somehow. The three figures were still there, but they were separated by what looked like a storm cloud, dark scribbles of gray and black crayon that obscured parts of the scene. "I'm going to take this to June," Miles announced, with the determination of someone who had made an important decision, "so she knows we still want her in our family." Alec's chest tightened. "Miles, I don't think—" "She needs to see it," Miles interrupted, a rare show of stubbornness. "She needs to know we miss her." And before Alec could stop him, Miles was walking toward the front door, drawing in one hand, tape in the other, moving with the purposeful stride of a child on a mission. "Okay," Alec said, reaching for his keys. "But Miles, we're driving there. And Miles, we might not see her. She might not want to talk to us right now." "That's okay," Miles said matter-of-factly. "Pictures don't need talking." The drive to June's apartment complex was quiet, filled with the weight of hope and dread in equal measure. Alec had driven past her building twice since the story broke, each time losing his nerve before reaching her door. What did you say to someone whose life you'd accidentally destroyed? How did you apologize for being exactly the kind of person she'd been taught not to trust? June's building was mercifully free of reporters, Apparently, the story had already lost its novelty, replaced by fresher scandals and newer targets. Alec parked in the visitor's spot, watching Miles fold his drawing into a neat square. "You sure about this, buddy?" Miles nodded and climbed out of the car, walking toward the building's entrance with more confidence than his father felt. June's apartment was on the second floor, number 2B, and they climbed the stairs in silence. Alec raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. Through the thin door, he could hear the sound of television, something mindless and comforting, the kind of background noise people use to fill empty spaces. He thought about June sitting alone in there, probably surrounded by the wreckage of her quiet life, and the guilt nearly brought him to his knees. But Miles had already stepped forward, pressing his drawing against the door and carefully taping each corner with the methodical precision of a child who wanted to get something exactly right. When he was finished, he stepped back to inspect his work, then pressed his small hand on the center of the paper. Alec sat at the kitchen table, staring at his laptop screen without seeing it. He'd tried calling June 17 times. Her phone went straight to voicemail now, and he couldn't blame her. The media attention had been brutal. Photographers camping outside her apartment, reporters calling her work, strangers on social media dissecting every detail of her life with the casual cruelty of people who had never been vulnerable themselves. His PR team had offered to make it go away, to paint her as an opportunist or a gold digger, to spin the story in whatever direction would protect his reputation. He had fired them on the spot. "Daddy?" Miles's voice was small, uncertain. He stood in the kitchen doorway, clutching his latest drawing, his hair sticking up at odd angles from sleep. "Is June mad at us?" Alec closed the laptop and opened his arms, gathering his son onto his lap. Miles felt smaller than usual, fragile in the way children became when their world shifted without explanation. "She's not mad at you, buddy. She's mad at me." "Why? How did you explain complicated adult failures to a 7-year-old? How did you tell your child that you'd been a coward, that your fear of being loved for the wrong reasons had led you to lie to the first person who loved you for the right ones?" "I made a mistake," Alec said simply. "I wasn't honest with June about some things, and now she doesn't trust me anymore." Miles considered this with the gravity he brought to all important matters. What kind of mistake? The kind that hurts people you care about, even when you didn't mean to. Miles was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the edges of his drawing. Finally, he looked up at his father with those two wise eyes. "Can you fix it?" "I don't know," Alec admitted. "I'm trying to figure that out." Miles slid off his lap and walked to the kitchen junk drawer, the one filled with tape and batteries and the detritus of daily life. He pulled out a roll of clear tape and held up his drawing. Another treehouse, but this one looked different, sadder somehow. The three figures were still there, but they were separated by what looked like a storm cloud, dark scribbles of gray and black crayon that obscured parts of the scene. "I'm going to take this to June," Miles announced with the determination of someone who'd made an important decision, "so she knows we still want her in our family." Alec's chest tightened. "Miles, I don't think—" "She needs to see it," Miles interrupted, a rare show of stubbornness. "She needs to know we miss her." And before Alec could stop him, Miles was walking toward the front door, drawing in one hand, tape in the other, moving with the purposeful stride of a child on a mission. "Okay," Alec said, reaching for his keys, "but we're driving there. And Miles, we might not see her. She might not want to talk to us right now." "That's okay," Miles said matter-of-factly. "Pictures don't need talking." The drive to June's apartment complex was quiet, filled with the weight of hope and dread in equal measure. Alec had driven past her building twice since the story broke, each time losing his nerve before reaching her door. What do you say to someone whose life you accidentally destroyed? How do you apologize for being exactly the kind of person she'd been taught not to trust? June's building was mercifully free of reporters. Apparently, the story had already lost its novelty, replaced by fresher scandals and newer targets. Alec parked in the visitor's spot, watching Miles carefully fold his drawing into a neat square. "You sure about this, buddy?" Miles nodded and climbed out of the car, walking toward the building's entrance with more confidence than his father felt. June's apartment was on the second floor, number 2B, and they climbed the stairs in silence. Alec raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. Through the thin door he could hear the sound of television, something mindless and comforting, the kind of background noise people use to fill empty spaces. He thought about June sitting alone in there, probably surrounded by the wreckage of her quiet life, and the guilt nearly brought him to his knees. But Miles had already stepped forward, pressing his drawing against the door and carefully taping each corner with the methodical precision of a child who wanted to get something exactly right. When he was finished, he stepped back to inspect his work, then pressed his small hand against the center of the paper.
"June," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "We miss you. We want you to come home." Alec closed his eyes, listening to his son's innocent plea echoing in the narrow hallway. When he opened them, Miles was already walking back toward the stairs, his mission complete. They drove home in the same heavy silence, but something had shifted. Not hope, exactly, but a sense of having done what they could. Miles had said what needed saying, had offered his heart in the only way he knew how. That evening, as Alec was cleaning up the dinner dishes, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Picture received. Beautiful work, as always. Tell Miles I keep all his drawings in a special place." Alec stared at the message, reading it 3 times before it sunk in. June had seen the drawing. She'd responded. It wasn't much, but it was something, a thread of connection in the vast space that had opened between them. He showed the text to Miles, who smiled for the first time in days. "She got it," Miles said with satisfaction. "Now she knows." "Knows what, buddy?" Miles looked at him with the patient expression he wore when explaining obvious things to slow adults. "That love doesn't stop just because people are sad." Meanwhile, in apartment 2B, June sat on her living room floor, surrounded by the drawings Miles had given her over the past 2 weeks. The treehouse family, the library scene, the cottage dinner, and now this newest one with its storm cloud and separated figures, taped to her door like a message from a world she'd tried to leave behind. She'd heard them in the hallway, Alec's hesitation, Miles's whispered words. She'd stood frozen on the other side of the door, hand pressed against the wood, close enough to touch them if not for the barrier between. When their footsteps faded, she opened the door to find Miles's latest creation waiting for her. The drawing showed the storm cloud beginning to clear in one corner, and there, small but unmistakable, was a rainbow made of careful crayon strokes. Miles had drawn hope into his sadness, had imagined a way through the darkness. June looked around her apartment, taking inventory of the life she'd built so carefully and seen dismantled so quickly. The job that had defined her was gone, at least temporarily. The privacy she'd treasured had been stripped away. The trust she had given so carefully had been broken. But Miles's drawings remained, and in them, she could see not just what had been lost, but what might still be possible. A little boy who had claimed her as family without conditions or expectations. A man who had made mistakes, but whose love for his son was absolute and pure. A chance at the kind of belonging she'd stopped believing in. Gloria found her there an hour later, still sitting on the floor with the drawings spread around her like pieces of a puzzle she was trying to solve. "You look like someone who's made a decision," Gloria said, settling beside her friend. "Maybe. Or maybe someone who's tired of running from the good things because they might not last." Gloria picked up one of the drawings, the treehouse with 3 figures in perfect harmony. "That little boy loves you, really loves you. And his daddy? Well, his daddy made some stupid choices, but watching him these past few days, he's been miserable without you." "How do you know?" "Because I may have driven by their place once or twice, Or 5 times, just to make sure they were okay. Gloria grinned sheepishly. What? I'm protective of all my people now, apparently. Even the ones who lie about being billionaires. June laughed despite herself. The first genuine laugh she'd managed in days. So what do I do? How do I trust someone who started our entire relationship with a lie? You start over, Gloria said simply. No more secrets, no more pretending to be someone you're not. You put all the cards on the table and see if what you've got is strong enough to survive the truth. June looked down at Miles's newest drawing, at the rainbow emerging from storm clouds, and there, small but unmistakable, was the 3 figures still reaching toward each other despite the darkness between them. Maybe it was time to find out. June stood outside the cottage door for 10 full minutes before she found the courage to knock. It was Friday evening, 5 days since Miles had left his drawing on her apartment door, and she'd spent every one of those days talking herself in and out of this moment. The yellow porch light cast long shadows across the weathered boards, and she could hear the soft murmur of voices inside. Alec reading bedtime stories, probably, his voice taking on different characters the way Miles had told her about it. When the door opened, Alec's face cycled through a dozen emotions in the space of a heartbeat. Surprise, hope, wariness, relief, all of it carefully controlled, as if he were afraid that too much reaction might send her running again. June! Her name came out like a breath he'd been holding. You came. I got Miles's drawing, she said, holding up the carefully folded paper. The one with the rainbow. Alec stepped aside to let her in, and June was struck again how peaceful the cottage felt. Nothing had changed since her last visit. The same warm light spilling across hardwood floors, the same herbs hanging in the kitchen window, the same sense of sanctuary she'd felt that first night. But everything felt different now, weighted with the knowledge of what lay beneath the surface. Is he asleep? She asked, nodding toward the stairs. Not yet. He's been... Alec paused, running his hand through his hair. He's been having trouble sleeping since everything happened. Keeps asking when you're coming back. June's chest tightened. Can I see him?
Alec nodded and led her up the narrow staircase. Miles's door was cracked open, warm light seeping through the gap. When they peered inside, he was sitting up in bed with his sketchbook, working on something with intense concentration by the light of his bedside lamp. Hey, buddy, Alec said softly. Someone's here to see you. Miles looked up, and when he saw June standing in the doorway, his face transformed with pure joy. June! He scrambled out of bed and launched himself at her, wrapping his arms around her waist with the fierce enthusiasm of someone who had been saving up hugs. June knelt down to his level, holding him tight and breathing in the scent of strawberry shampoo and little boy sweetness. Hi, sweetheart. I got your picture. It was beautiful. I knew you'd come back, Miles said with the absolute certainty of childhood faith. I drew the rainbow because storms always end, and then everything grows better. You're very wise, June said, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. What are you working on now? Miles retrieved his sketchbook and showed her his latest creation. It was another treehouse, but this one was different from all the others. Instead of 3 figures, there were dozens. Children climbing the rope ladder, adults sitting on the platform reading books, families picnicking in the garden below. It looked like a community, a place where anyone could belong. It's a library treehouse for all the kids who need stories. You could read to them every day. June's eyes filled with tears. Even in his own confusion and hurt, Miles was thinking about other children, other people who might need the same belonging he'd found. It's perfect, she whispered. June has to go talk to Daddy now, but she'll come say goodnight before she leaves, okay? Miles nodded and settled back into bed, but his eyes stayed fixed on June. You're not leaving forever, are you? June looked at this beautiful, trusting child who had drawn rainbows out of storm clouds, who had taped his heart to her door, who had somehow decided she was worth fighting for. No, sweetheart, I'm not leaving forever. Downstairs, she and Alec sat on opposite ends of the living room couch, the careful distance between them speaking volumes. The easy intimacy they'd found so quickly was gone, replaced by the awkward formality of people who had hurt each other and weren't sure how to find their way back. "I owe you an explanation," Alec began. "Yes, you do." June's voice was steady, but he could hear the pain underneath. "Start with why you lied to me." Alec was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. After Caroline died, the media attention was intense. They wanted to know everything: how I was coping, whether I was dating, what kind of father I was without her. Every time Miles and I went anywhere, there were cameras. Every woman who showed interest in me, they assumed she was after money or trying to become the next Mrs. Grayson. June listened without interrupting, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "So I stepped back, hired people to run the day-to-day operations, moved out here, tried to give Miles a normal childhood. But I was lonely, and he was lonely. And when Nolan suggested I try dating again, I shrugged helplessly. I thought if I hid who I was, I could find someone who saw me for who I really am, not the net worth or the company or the Forbes articles." "And what about me?" June asked quietly. "What about my right to make an informed decision about who I was getting involved with?" "You're right," Alex said simply. "I took that choice away from you, and I'm sorry. I told myself I was protecting us both, but really I was protecting myself. I was a coward." June studied his face in the lamplight, looking for signs of deception or manipulation, but all she saw was exhaustion and regret and something that looked like hope hanging by a thread. "Do you know what it felt like to find out through a tabloid headline that the man I was falling in love with wasn't who he said he was? To have my entire life picked apart by strangers who decided I was either a gold digger or a naive fool?" Alec flinched. "I never wanted that to happen. I hired a security firm to try to keep our relationship private, but that's the point, isn't it?" June interrupted. "You were managing me, managing the situation, making decisions about my life without telling me what was really going on." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of broken trust heavy between them. Outside, the wind picked up, sending pine branches scratching against the windows like fingers trying to get in. "I lost my job," June said finally. "Administrative leave while they assess the situation. 20 kids who depend on me for support, and I can't help them because I'm a liability now."
"It's artistic," June called back, stepping away to assess her handiwork. "Whimsical. Children like whimsical." "Children like letters that look like letters," Gloria retorted, but she was grinning. "Good thing you're better with kids than you are with sign painting." The van had been Alec's idea, presented quietly one morning, after Miles had mentioned missing the library sessions at school. June's administrative leave had become permanent resignation, not because the district forced her out, but because she'd realized she wanted something different. Something that could reach the kids who needed stories most, who might not have access to traditional library programs. The beautiful thing about mobile literacy, she'd explained to the local newspaper reporter who'd covered the Story Nest launch, is that we can go wherever children are. Trailer parks, low-income neighborhoods, rural communities that might not have easy access to libraries. Every child deserves to have someone read to them, to see themselves reflected in stories, to know that books can be doorways to anywhere. What she hadn't mentioned in the interview was the funding source, a private foundation that Alec had established specifically to support literacy programs. He'd insisted on staying completely out of the public eye, working through intermediaries and legal teams to ensure the project could stand on its own merits. "I don't want anyone to think this is about me trying to buy my way back into your good graces," he'd said during one of their careful planning conversations. "This is about Miles and kids like him who need what you have to offer." But June knew better. It was about all of those things. But it was also about a man who had learned to love through action rather than words, who understood that the best apologies were lived rather than spoken. Miles appeared around the side of the van, his face flushed with excitement and his hands covered in dirt.
"June, come see what we planted." He led her to the small garden plot behind the community center where they'd parked for the day's reading program. He and 3 other children had spent the morning planting sunflower seeds while listening to stories, creating what Miles called a story garden, where books and growing things could exist side by side. "These are going to be taller than the van," announced Sophia, a 6-year-old with pigtails and unwavering confidence in the power of sunflower seeds. "Taller than the trees, probably taller than the sky." "That's very tall sunflowers," June agreed seriously. "What will you do when they reach the clouds?" "Climb them," Sophia said without hesitation. "Like Jack and the Beanstalk, but with flowers instead of beans." June looked around at the small group of children who had gathered for the morning session, kids from the nearby housing complex who might not otherwise have access to library programs, whose parents worked multiple jobs and couldn't always make it to traditional story times. This was exactly what she'd envisioned. Literacy work that met families where they were, without judgment or barriers. Her phone buzzed with a text from Alec. "How's the first day going?" She snapped a photo of Miles helping Sophia measure the distance between sunflower seeds and sent it back with the message, "Perfect. He's a natural teacher." Alec's response came back immediately. "Gets that from his mom. Both of them." June smiled, tucking her phone away as Gloria called for attention. "Okay, story time. Everyone grab a blanket and find a spot." The afternoon session was their biggest yet. 15 children, ranging from toddlers to middle schoolers, all settling in for the kind of interactive storytelling that June had perfected over years of school counseling. She'd chosen the giving tree for the older kids and was planning to follow it with discussion about kindness and generosity. But as she opened the book, she noticed Miles sitting slightly apart from the group, his sketchbook open on his lap. It wasn't unusual. He often drew during story time, but something about his posture caught her attention. He looked pensive, almost sad. June made her way through the story, asking questions and encouraging the children to share their thoughts about the tree's choices. When she finished, she noticed Miles had been drawing steadily throughout, his pencil moving with the focused intensity she'd come to recognize as his processing mode. During the craft activity that followed, decorating bookmarks with leaves and pressed flowers, June kneeled beside him. "What are you working on, sweetheart?" "I can fix that," Alex said immediately. "I can make some calls. Explain—" "No." June's voice was firm. "You can't fix this by throwing money at it or using your connections. This is my problem to solve." Alec nodded, chastened. "You're right. I'm sorry." They lapsed into silence again, but it felt different now. Less hostile, more thoughtful. June looked around the room, taking in the details she'd missed before. Caroline's artwork mixed with Miles's creations on the walls. Family photos that showed glimpses of a life built with intention and love. A home that had been shaped by loss, but wasn't defined by it. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Anything." "The night we had dinner here, when Miles asked if I wanted to be your family, did you mean it? Or were you just caught up in the moment?" Alec turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "I meant it more than I've meant anything in years. June, what we built those first 2 weeks, it wasn't fake. My feelings for you, Miles's attachment to you, the way you fit into our lives, none of that was pretending. But it was built on a lie." "It was built on fear," Alec corrected gently. "My fear that you wouldn't want the real me. My fear that Miles would get hurt again. My fear that what we had was too good to be real." June was quiet for a long time, thinking about the drawings upstairs, about Miles's absolute faith that she would come back, about the choice she had to make between the safety of solitude and the risk of belonging. "I'm scared too," she admitted finally. "I'm scared of being the foster kid who thought she could fit into a family that wasn't really hers. I'm scared of loving Miles and having to leave him someday. I'm scared that this feeling, This sense of finally being home is just wishful thinking. "So what do we do?" Alec asked. June looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the man who made Mickey Mouse pancakes on Saturday mornings, who had learned to garden because his wife loved growing things, who read bedtime stories with different voices for every character. She saw the father, who had spent 3 years rebuilding his life around his son's needs, who would rather be lonely than risk Miles getting hurt. And she saw something else. The possibility of starting over, this time with honesty. "We try again," she said quietly. "No more secrets, no more managing the situation. We tell each other the truth even when it's uncomfortable." Alec's face transformed with relief and something deeper. Hope, maybe, or gratitude. "No more secrets," he agreed. From upstairs came a small voice. "June, are you still there?" June smiled and stood up. "I promised someone I'd say goodnight." When she reached Miles's room, he was sitting up in bed again, his latest drawing clutched in his hands. This one showed 2 adults sitting on a couch, talking, while a small boy watched from the stairs. In the corner, he'd drawn a sun rising over mountains. "For the morning," Miles explained, pressing the drawing into her hands. "When everything starts over." June hugged him tight, marveling at his resilience, his faith in new beginnings. "Thank you, sweetheart. Sweet dreams." As she tucked him back into bed, Miles caught her hand. "June, are you going to stay this time?" June thought about the conversation downstairs, about the choice she had made to risk her heart again, about the little boy who had drawn rainbows into storm clouds. "I'm going to try," she said. "We're all going to try." Miles smiled and closed his eyes, finally ready for sleep. "That's all anyone can do," he said, with the wisdom of someone who had learned that trying was sometimes enough. As June turned off his light and headed back downstairs, she thought about the conversation she and Alex still needed to finish, about the trust they would have to rebuild, about the future they might create together if they were brave enough to be honest. For the first time in days, she felt something other than fear. She felt possibility. 6 weeks later, June stood in front of a bright yellow van, paintbrush in hand, adding the final touches to the words "Story Nest" written in cheerful blue letters across the side. The mobile library project had started as a conversation at breakfast, evolved into careful planning sessions at the cottage kitchen table, and somehow transformed into this, a fully equipped literacy outreach program that would bring books and reading support directly to underserved communities throughout Oregon. "The W is crooked," Gloria called from where she was organizing book bins with military precision. "Very crooked, like embarrassingly crooked."
Miles showed her his latest creation, and June's breath caught. It was the most detailed drawing he'd ever made, showing the Story Nest van surrounded by children and adults with books floating like birds through the scene. But in the center, he'd drawn 3 figures that were unmistakably their little family, herself, Alec, and Miles, standing together beneath a tree that looked remarkably like the giving tree from the story. "It's our story," Miles explained quietly, "the one where everyone finds what they need." June studied the drawing more closely and realized that Miles had included details from their real life. The cottage in the background, the sunflower garden, even Caroline's portrait hanging from one of the tree's branches like a cherished ornament rather than a sad memory. "Miles," she said softly, "this is incredible. You've shown how all our stories connect." He nodded seriously. "Daddy says that's what families do. They make new stories together, but they keep the old ones too." As the afternoon wound down and families began collecting their children, June found herself thinking about the conversation she and Alec had been building toward for weeks. They'd been carefully rebuilding trust, taking things slowly, learning to be honest about their fears and hopes. But lately, she'd sensed something shifting, a readiness, maybe, to stop being so careful and start being brave.
When Alec arrived to pick up Miles, he spent time chatting with the other parents, asking about their children's reading interests and listening to their feedback about the program. June watched him navigate these conversations with genuine warmth, no trace of the awkwardness she might have expected from someone accustomed to boardrooms rather than playground politics. "You're good at this," she told him as they loaded the van with supplies. "At what?" "Being normal. Being just Miles's dad instead of CEO Alec Grayson." Alec smiled, the kind of real smile she'd learned to distinguish from his polite professional expression. "Turns out, I like being just Miles's dad. It's a lot less complicated than the other thing." As they drove back to the cottage in their small convoy, June and Gloria in the Story Nest van, Alec and Miles following behind, June felt something settle in her chest. Not the frantic hope of early romance, but something steadier, something that felt like home. "So," Gloria said, breaking the comfortable silence, "when are you going to marry that man?" June nearly swerved off the road. "Gloria!" "What? I'm just saying. He's clearly crazy about you. Miles has been planning your wedding since that first treehouse drawing, and you light up like a Christmas tree every time he texts you. How much more obvious do you need it to be?" June thought about the careful way she and Alec had been approaching their relationship, the deliberate slowness they'd adopted after the media disaster. They'd been so focused on rebuilding trust that they maybe lost sight of the simple truth. They loved each other. All three of them loved each other in the messy, complicated, beautiful way that real families did. "I don't know if he's ready for that," June said quietly. "Honey," Gloria said, with the gentle exasperation of a best friend who'd watched too much careful circling, "that man has been ready since the day you hugged his kid in a coffee shop. The question is whether you're ready to stop protecting yourself long enough to let it happen." As they pulled into the cottage driveway, June saw Miles racing toward the van with a fresh drawing clutched in his hands. This one showed a woman in a flowing white dress standing beside a man in a simple suit, with a small boy between them holding both their hands. Above them, he'd drawn a banner that read, "Forever Family," in his careful first-grade lettering. Maybe Gloria was right. Maybe it was time to stop being so careful and start being brave. As Miles pressed his latest artistic vision into her hands, June looked over his head to meet Alec's eyes. What she saw there, love and hope and a readiness to take the next step, made her heart race with possibility. "What do you think?" Miles asked, studying her face with the intensity of an artist awaiting critique. June looked down at the drawing, at the three figures bound together by love and choice and the kind of faith that could grow sunflowers tall enough to reach the sky. "It's the best story I've ever seen," she said, and meant every word. Spring arrived at the cottage like a gentle promise capped. The sunflowers Miles had planted behind the community center were already sprouting their first true leaves, and Caroline's herb garden was bursting with new growth, chives and parsley and mint that filled the air with the scent of possibility. June had been staying at the cottage 3 nights a week for the past month, a gradual transition that felt as natural as breathing. The Story Nest program had expanded to serve 6 communities, with the waiting list of schools and community centers requesting visits. June had hired 2 part-time assistants and was training them in what she privately called the Miles method, the art of seeing each child as an individual story worth telling, of creating space for quiet kids to flourish alongside the outgoing ones. But it was a Saturday morning in late April that changed everything. June awoke to the sound of whispered voices and muffled giggles from downstairs, followed by the distinctive sound of someone trying very hard to be quiet while making breakfast. She stretched in the cottage's guest bedroom, her room now, really, though they hadn't made any formal declarations about living arrangements, and smiled at the familiar chaos of Alec and Miles attempting surprise pancakes. When she made her way downstairs, she found them both covered in flour, standing guard over a plate of Mickey Mouse pancakes that looked only vaguely mouse-like. "We made breakfast," Miles announced proudly, his hair sticking up at impossible angles. "Daddy let me crack the eggs." "I can see that," June said, noting the eggshell fragments scattered across the counter. "They look delicious." "We're having a picnic," Miles continued, bouncing on his toes with excitement. A special picnic, right, Daddy? Alec met June's eyes over Miles's head, and she saw something there that made her pulse quicken. Nervousness, maybe, mixed with the kind of anticipation that came before life-changing moments. A picnic sounds perfect, she said carefully. What's the occasion? It's a surprise, Miles said, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a whisper, but was actually audible from 3 rooms away. But it's the best surprise ever. An hour later, they were settled on a blanket beneath the old oak tree in the cottage's backyard, the same tree where Caroline's tire swing still hung, moving gently in the spring breeze. June had learned to find comfort in these remnants of the life that came before. They weren't threats to be eliminated, but rather foundations upon which something new could be built. Miles had been unusually fidgety throughout lunch, checking and rechecking his backpack as if it contained precious cargo, which June was beginning to suspect it did. Okay, Miles announced suddenly, scrambling to his feet with the decisive air of someone who had reached an important conclusion. It's time for the surprise. He disappeared into the cottage and returned carrying a small wooden box that June recognized as one of Caroline's art supply containers. But when he opened it, instead of brushes and paints, it contained something that June's heart stopped entirely. Nestled in tissue paper was a ring. But not just any ring. This was clearly a collaboration between a 7-year-old's imagination and an adult's execution. The band was simple silver, but instead of a traditional stone, it held a small glass dome containing what looked like crayon shavings, Miles explained proudly, from all my favorite colors, and some of Mama's special pencils, too. Daddy had it made special. June stared at the ring, speechless. It was the most beautiful, ridiculous, perfect thing she'd ever seen. Only Miles would think to capture the essence of their relationship in art supplies. Only Alec would understand that she'd treasure this more than any diamond. There's more, Miles continued, reaching into the box again. This time he pulled out a folded piece of paper, another drawing, but this one was different. It showed their treehouse family, but now they were all wearing matching rings made of rainbow colors. At the bottom, in his careful handwriting, he'd written, "Will you marry us?" June looked up to find Alec kneeling beside the blanket, his face vulnerable in a way that reminded her of that first night at the cafe when he'd watched her hug his son and realized something fundamental was shifting. "June," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion, "I know we've taken the long way to get here. I know I made mistakes that could have cost us everything, but these past few months, watching you with Miles, building something meaningful together." He paused, searching for words. "I don't want to date you anymore. I don't want to be careful anymore. I want to marry you. I want Miles to have the mom he's been drawing in pictures since the day he met you. I want us to be a real family." Miles plopped down beside them, his face serious. "And I want you to be my real mom, not just friend mom or sometimes mom, real mom who stays forever and reads bedtime stories and helps with homework and comes to school plays." June felt tears spilling down her cheeks as she looked between them. This man who had learned to love without protecting himself, this child who somehow decided she was worth fighting for even when the adults in his life were too scared to try. "The ring doesn't have to fit right now," Alec continued, misreading her silence as hesitation. "We can get it resized, or if you don't like it—" "It's perfect," June interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's absolutely perfect." She held out her left hand, and Miles carefully slipped the ring onto her finger. It was slightly too big, but somehow that felt right too. Room to grow, space for their love to expand and settle into something permanent. "Is that a yes?" Miles asked, his eyes wide with hope. June looked around at the scene they'd created. The picnic blanket covered with crumbs and art supplies, the tire swing moving in the breeze like a blessing from the past. the cottage windows reflecting afternoon sunlight like promise. This wasn't the fairy tale she dreamed of as a little girl in foster care with white dresses and cathedral ceremonies. This was better. This was real. "That's a yes," she said, and found herself laughing and crying at the same time as Miles launched himself into her arms with a whoop of triumph. Alec wrapped his arms around both of them, and for a moment they were just a tangle of limbs and laughter and overwhelming joy. When they finally untangled, Miles was already pulling his sketchbook from his backpack. "I need to draw this," he announced with the seriousness of a court reporter, "for the wedding book."
"Wedding book?" June asked. "I'm making a book of all our family pictures," Miles explained, his pencil already moving across the paper. "Starting with the first treehouse drawing and ending with the wedding, and then all the pictures that come after." June watched him work, marveling at the way he'd appointed himself the official chronicler of their love story. In his drawing, the three of them were sitting beneath the oak tree, all wearing crowns made of flowers, all smiling wide enough to show their teeth. As the afternoon faded into evening, they moved the celebration inside. Alec opened a bottle of champagne, while June made hot chocolate for Miles, and they spent the evening looking through Miles's collection of drawings, their relationship told in crayon and colored pencil, from that first lonely treehouse to today's engagement portrait. "When's the wedding?" Miles asked, as Alec carried him upstairs for bed. "When do you think it should be?" June asked, following them up. Miles considered this carefully as Alec tucked him in. "Soon," he decided, "but not too soon. I need time to finish the wedding book, and the sunflowers should be tall enough for the pictures." "The sunflowers," Alec repeated with a smile. "Of course." As they kissed Miles goodnight and turned off his light, June caught sight of his art wall, now expanded to include every drawing he'd made of their growing family. Tomorrow, she realized, he'd add tonight's engagement scene to the collection, another page in the story they were writing together. Downstairs, she and Alec settled on the couch with their champagne, the crazy, beautiful ring catching the lamplight as June turned her hand to admire it. "No regrets?" Alec asked quietly. June thought about the question seriously, considering everything that had brought them to this moment. The media storm, the broken trust, the careful rebuilding, the choice to love despite the risk. "None," she said firmly. "Not a single one." Outside, the spring peepers were beginning their evening chorus, and somewhere in the distance an owl called to its mate. June curled against Alec's side, thinking about the future they were building. Story nest expanding to reach even more children, Miles growing up with the security of belonging, the quiet joy of ordinary days filled with extraordinary love. "What are you thinking about?" Alec murmured against her hair. "Happy endings, and how they're really just beginnings in disguise." Later that night, June found a new drawing tucked under her pillow, Miles's final creation of the day. It showed a woman reading to a group of children gathered around a massive sunflower, its face turned toward the sun like hope made visible. At the bottom, he'd written in his careful script, "Mama June and the Story Garden." She fell asleep holding the drawing, already planning the children's book they would write together someday, already imagining the stories they would tell about love that bloomed in unexpected places, about families formed not by blood, but by choice, about the magic that happened when someone saw you exactly as you were and decided you were worth keeping. In the morning, she would wake up engaged to a man who loved her enough to let her be herself completely, and she would help a little boy plant more sunflowers in their story garden, and she would drive the bright yellow van to communities where children waited for someone to tell them they mattered.
But tonight, she simply smiled in her sleep and dreamed of tree houses and rainbows and all the beautiful chaos of a life built on love and brave enough to believe in forever.